For project number 1, I'm going to be making tea or coffee stained paper, and I actually teased this in my last video and just called it aged paper because I was testing it out at that time, so I'm so excited to finally show you guys how I made it. I'm grabbing an assortment of different containers as well as paintbrushes and of course paper. For the first little bowl, I'm adding in 3 tea bags, and for the second, I'm using some coffee and this little loose leaf tea grabber thing to get about a tablespoon of that. If you don't have this, you can just strain the mixture before you use it. Then I added some boiling water, about a half a cup of it, to either of those bowls. The first way I'm going to do this is just use my paintbrushes dipped in either of the mixtures to cover it by hand, and I find that you can distribute it a lot more evenly this way. But if you're interested in a quicker method, you can grab a bunch of papers like this and just dump the mixture on top. The reason why I'm using both is because I found that the mixtures were very similar in color and was okay with combining the two. After they are fully submerged, the way I am drying these is with a hair dryer, which is the quickest drying method, but you can also lay them out in the sun or make a little makeshift clothesline for your paper with some yarn weighed down by books. Let it air dry for a while and you're done. For project number 2, I'm going to be making a notebook from the paper that we stained previously. You could also definitely use just normal white printer paper, but I think this adds a little bit more to the notebook and I really like how it looks. So taking whatever paper you would like, you're going to want about 20 pages. I'm starting off with 10 and I'm going to fold each one long ways and then short ways. Unfolding the second fold, I'm going to use the crease to guide me in cutting across that line so that you have 2 little folded pieces. I'm doing this with every single piece of paper until I have a bunch of them. Like I said, I just started out with 10 initially, so I added another 10 pieces to that afterwards. Once I have all of my pieces cut out, I'm going to group 3 together, so grabbing one and then sticking 2 other folded pieces in the middle of that so that I have all of these small little groups. I also had an odd number at the end, so quickly fold it and cut another one to make sure that there were 3 in every single one. Once all of my groups were complete, I'm going to make sure that they're all even together and then hold them folded edge up and make 4 pencil markings across that evenly spaced out, making sure that the marking gets on every single layer of paper. Now with those markings, I'm going to go through each group of paper and poke through all of those points with a sewing needle, making sure that you get through every single layer, doing this to, like I said, all of the groups. Once that was done, I'm going to thread that needle that I was using, making sure to knot the end and then go in the far left hole, bringing that from the outside to the inside, then coming back to the front in the second one, doing the same thing, going into the third one, and coming out the fourth one. When at the far right side, I'm going to make my way back to the left, so going in the second from the right hole, third from the right, and then back into the far left one. When on the inside, I'm going to loop my needle under that thread and make 2 knots before once again going through that far left hole to the outside. And this is the base for sewing all of the other ones. So I'm grabbing my second group of paper, going through the far left of that one, and after coming out the second one, I'm going to put my needle behind the second group of thread and then under that first one so that it creates a loop around the 2, then going back into that second hole so that it secures the 2 pages together at that point. I'm then going to come out of the third and do the same exact thing, putting it back through that point. At the far one, I'm going to put it under the thread to the left and then grab my third group of papers to do the same exact thing except from right to left. And also when I'm securing the 2 together, I'm going to go behind the loop that I made previously instead of the 2 lengths of thread like I did on the first one. So behind the loops instead of the lengths of thread. Going back into the hole just like before, doing the same thing right to left. And you're just going to do that back and forth, always going behind the previously made row of loops. If you run out of thread, just knot it off and begin again where you ended once you've rethreaded. Nearing the end here, I'm just sewing on the last group of paper and knotting it off officially. Here is all of the pages sewn together. I'm going to flatten those a bit under this old book before grabbing some cardboard, a pencil, and scissors. Placing my pages onto the cardboard, I'm going to trace it out and then cut it out twice for the front and back of the cover. Grabbing another piece of cardboard, I'm going to lay it vertically and mark out the spine. But when cutting this out, I'm going to add just a tiny bit to either side so that if you add anything thick into the book, it will be able to expand. Once all of my pieces were cut out, I'm grabbing this piece of black cardstock as well as some glue, and I'm going to glue down the spine in the middle of the paper and then the front and back of the cover slightly beside that. Once everything was glued on, I'm going to fold in all 4 corners and glue those down as well. Then I'm going to snip on either side of the gap between the spine and the covers so that I can glue in between those spaces and fold them up. Once that's done, all I have to do is glue everywhere else and fold up the rest of the paper. I'm also using the help of this book to make sure everything dries flat. Once that is complete, you can see how it will fold into the cover. And to finish it off before we add the pages, I'm going to grab a bit more cardstock and cut out pieces to cover the insides. I don't know why I stopped a tiny bit before the spine. Don't do that, cover the whole thing. I don't know where my mind was at, but once the inside is looking good as well, I'm just going to put a bit of glue on the actual spine of the pages and then a thick line of it on the cardboard spine to officially place it in and glue it down. If you want it to be super secure, you could use something like super glue instead of school glue, but I've had the book for a while and it's been holding up really well, so either way works. Technically it is done now, but I just wanted to add this little "This book belongs to" piece of paper on the inside, so after gluing it, I was done. Project number 3, I'm going to be making a collage, and I find that often in dark academia decor these are very present, whether they are just for aesthetic value or inspiration. I really like what they add to a room, so I'm going to be using a few different materials to make a collage. The first one being a map. So I'm taking this old map book and finding a page where I like the colors and line size. I'm then tearing that out, and I did actually create a sizable rip on the side, but I covered it up later, so it was fine. Then flipping it over, I'm going to make a smaller portion of that tea mixture from earlier to paint on all of the edges as well as a little bit in the middle. This was already kind of crinkled and aged looking, but I wanted to enhance that even more, and I also did a bit of scrunching at the corners. Next, I'm grabbing this Night at the Museum book. It's like a junior novelization, and I have absolutely no idea how this came to be in my possession, but I have no use for it, nor am I going to read it, so in this case, I am okay with ripping out a few pages, but normally I do not advocate for book slaughter, so if all of your books are good and readable, please don't do this. Just look up book pages and you can print off a few. I just went through the book and tried to look for some meaningful or interesting sentences and ripped those out. Once I had 3, I'm going to do a few different things to them. The first one, I'm just cutting out the sentence, which says, "Yes, and I have a bunch of questions." Next, I'm using this brush pen to black out every single line but the one I really want to focus on. And then the last one, I'm again taking that tea mixture and brushing a bit on it, mostly at the top, and then taking a brown marker and circling the words I want to highlight the most. Moving on from those, I'm going to turn to my trusty IKEA magazines and rip out some pages where I like either the entire background, like this greenery one where I'm evening up the edges, or some smaller pieces that I liked in the displays, cutting out each of those individually. Next, I'm just finding this piece of sheet music and printing it off of my computer, and of course the only thing you really have to do with this is cut it out, but even though it was already aged looking, I wanted to tear off the corners and also scrunch and add just a tiny bit more of that tea mixture to really enhance the yellowed browning effect of an old piece of paper. Now, taking some pieces of paper from earlier, including this lined one that I stained, I am also taking my favorite poem book and flipping through to see if I can find any dark academia feeling poems or one that I just thought was really nice, and landed on this one called "Come Little Leaves." I'm just using a thin-tipped Sharpie to write everything out. I'm using a mixture of cursive and print for this, depending on where in the poem I am. After all of it was printed out, I also decided to rip off the bottom just because there was a sizable amount of empty room and I wanted all the focus to be on the words. And lastly is just to use photos. You could use new ones, old ones, one that you print off the internet. I think using family ones could be really cool. I don't know who these two girls are, but this is Frank Lloyd Wright, my favorite architect, so make it as personal or or as random as you'd like. To hang up the pieces, I'm using a combination of tapes as well as this yellow blue tack and pins. A technique I like to follow with collages is just to start with the bigger pieces and fill in with the small ones, and it usually works out pretty well. Here's how it turned out. Lastly, for project number 4, I'm making this embroidered fabric bookmark. What you'll need is your material of choice, a ruler, some embroidery floss, a needle, and scissors. I'm starting off by folding my fabric in half and marking out a 3 by 8 inch rectangle with just a normal pencil, and then pinning all the way around that so when I cut it out, the 2 layers won't shift. Setting aside one of my pieces, I'm going to draw 3 circles with my pencil on the first piece and then 2 circles inside the top 2 to make 3 moon phases. Grabbing my embroidery floss and cutting a length of it, I'm splitting it into 2, so I'm only using 3 strands, then threading that through my needle and knotting the other side. Starting at the bottom circle, I'm going to come up through the material and then go behind that and then up a little bit in front of it to do a back stitch. You're always going to want to go in the last hole made and then a little bit in front. I find that smaller stitches look best with embroidery. To end it off, I'm sending my needle to the other side and grabbing a few of the previous stitches to go under and then loop through to make a few knots, then cutting off the excess. I'm going to use the same process for both of the other shapes, making sure that I am following the lines that I made previously and doing the same exact knots, making sure to snip the excess. Once the embroidery is done, I'm taking my other piece of material and put it good side onto good side, pinning around that with the exception of one end, leaving that open. I'm going to just straight stitch all the way around that, keeping it pretty close to the edge so that it doesn't affect the size of the bookmark too much. I'm also doing a few stitches on either side of the side that we want to keep open, just so it's a bit easier to fold in later. Setting my machine aside, I'm going to flip that right side out. I'm then going to flip in the side that was open so that I can grab this bit of material and press it all down to top stitch. This will make it a lot easier to do so. Once done with that, I'm again grabbing my machine and top stitching it all the way around to close that opening as well as just give it a cleaner look. Once the stitching is done, you can be done here, but I'm going to fold over the top and snip a little bit, creating a hole to do some eyelet stitches. So I'm threading my needle with 3 strands of embroidery floss and coming up under that hole, bringing my embroidery floss from the left to the right around the back, pulling up and then towards me to create the eyelet stitch. You're going to want to do the same thing with your needle, always going to the right of the last stitch to go all the way around so that it looks like this when you're done. I'm then going to take more white embroidery floss, cutting a length of that and wrapping it around 4 fingers about 30 times. Then grabbing 2 other strands of material, using the first one to fold in half and put through the eyelet, making a slip knot, and then tying it around the top of that bunch of thread, and then using the other to tie off the top, cutting that open and evening it up for the tassel. Because we did a slip knot, you can also change out the tassel and you're done.